The Portrait from the Looking Glass. In the gloomy chambers of an ancient mansion on the outskirts of Boston lived an artist named Theodor Raven, whose name was whispered in salons and galleries. His portraits were renowned for their striking resemblance to the originals. But there was something more, something that made viewers avert their gaze, feeling an inexplicable trepidation. Raven was tall and lean, with a pale face framed by raven black hair. His deep-set eyes seemed to penetrate into the very soul of the beholder, extracting their innermost secrets. He rarely left his dwelling, preferring solitude to interaction with the outside world. Raven's mansion was as gloomy as its inhabitant. Stained glass windows allowed only dim light, casting bizarre shadows in the long corridors. The walls were adorned with portraits of unknown people, whose gazes seemed to follow every step of a visitor. On a cloudy autumn day, Theodor discovered something unusual in a far corner of the attic, a massive mirror in an intricately carved ebony frame. He couldn't remember ever seeing it before. The mirror's surface was covered with a thick layer of dust, but even through it, Raven felt a strange attraction. Carefully wiping the mirror, the artist peered into it and recoiled. For a moment, it seemed to him that his reflection moved differently than he did. Theodor blinked, and the illusion vanished. Intrigued, he decided to move the mirror to his studio. From that day, Raven's work changed. He positioned the mirror so that he could see the reflections of his models in it, and the portraits became even more lifelike and expressive. Clients were delighted, but the artist himself felt a growing unease. The first alarming sign came with Mrs. Eleonora Gray, the widow of a well-known industrialist. After a posing session, she complained of weakness and dizziness. A week later, Theodor learned of her sudden death. The portrait, however, seemed to radiate vitality, Mrs. Gray's eyes appearing to follow the viewer, with a barely noticeable smile playing on her lips. Raven tried to convince himself it was mere coincidence, but the seed of doubt had already begun to gnaw at his soul. He continued to work, and with each new portrait his anxiety grew. Clients grew pale, losing their vitality, while their images on canvas, conversely, seemed increasingly alive. Theodor began to avoid society, locking himself in his studio. He spent hours gazing into the mysterious mirror, trying to unravel its secret. In his mind, mad theories about the nature of soul and art, about the boundary between life and death, began to form. One night, exhausted by insomnia and tormented by guilt, Raven decided to conduct an experiment. He invited a young man, Jonathan Foster, an aspiring poet whose verses were full of life and passion, to his house. Jonathan Foster arrived at the mansion at sunset. The young poet was full of enthusiasm, flattered by the attention of the famous artist. Raven led him to the studio, where a canvas and paints were already prepared. "Please, sit here," Theodor said, pointing to a chair in front of the mirror. "And don't worry about sitting still. Just be yourself." Jonathan obediently sat down, curiously examining the unusual mirror. Raven began his work, his brush flying across the canvas with feverish speed. From time to time he glanced at Foster's reflection in the mirror, and each time his hand began to move even faster. An hour passed, then another. Jonathan began to feel a strange fatigue, his eyelids growing heavy. "Mr. Raven," he mumbled, "I feel a bit strange." Theodor didn't respond, completely absorbed in his work. His eyes were burning, beads of sweat on his forehead. He seemed to be in a trance. Suddenly, Jonathan cried out. For a moment he thought he saw his reflection in the mirror move independently, reaching out to him. He tried to stand, but found he couldn't move. "What? What's happening?" he whispered in horror. Raven finally tore himself away from the canvas. His gaze was wild, almost mad. "Art demands sacrifices, my young friend." He spoke in a hoarse voice. "But fear not, you'll become immortal." Jonathan tried to scream, but only a weak moan escaped his throat. He felt life leaving his body, as if drawn out by an invisible force. In the mirror he saw his reflection becoming brighter and more alive, while he himself grew weaker. Theodor continued to paint with frenzied energy. On the canvas, an image of Jonathan emerged, not the pale and frightened youth sitting before him, but the vibrant and passionate young poet he had been just a few hours ago. When the last brushstroke fell on the canvas, Jonathan Foster slumped lifelessly in the chair. Raven stepped back, contemplating his creation. From the portrait, Jonathan looked at him, his eyes shining, lips seemingly about to part to recite poetry. Theodor collapsed to his knees, shaking. What had he done? Had his suspicions been confirmed? Was the mirror really sucking the life out of his models, transferring it onto the canvas? With trembling hands, he covered Jonathan's body with a sheet and carried it to the basement. Returning to the studio, Raven stood for a long time before the mirror, staring at his reflection. It looked pale, emaciated, but deep in his eyes burned a feverish fire. "I must stop," he whispered. "This is madness. It's a crime." But even as he spoke these words, Theodor knew he couldn't stop. Art had become his obsession, his curse. He felt trapped between two worlds, the reality where his works brought death, and the world of art where he created true life. The following weeks passed as if in a fog. Raven barely slept, rarely ate. He worked continuously, creating portrait after portrait. Rumors of mysterious disappearances and sudden deaths began to spread through Boston, but no one connected them to the reclusive artist. Theodor began to avoid mirrors, afraid to see what he had become. His hair had turned gray. His skin took on an earthen hue. But the portraits he created became increasingly vivid and beautiful. One night, exhausted by insomnia and guilt, Raven decided to end this madness. He stood before the cursed mirror, holding a brush and a blank canvas. "I will end this," he whispered, "even if it costs me my life." Theodor began to paint his self-portrait. His brush moved across the canvas with feverish speed. He painted himself, not as the emaciated, gray-haired man he had become, but as the young, vibrant artist he once was. With each stroke, he felt strength leaving his body, but stubbornly continued to work. Hours flew by, unnoticed. The candles in the studio burned low, casting bizarre shadows on the walls. Raven didn't take his eyes off the mirror, watching as his reflection gradually changed. It grew younger, brighter, while the artist himself felt life draining from him. When the first rays of dawn penetrated the studio window, Theodor made the final stroke. He stepped back to assess his work and froze in amazement. Looking at him from the canvas was himself, but not just a younger version. It was an idealized image, the embodiment of everything he had ever dreamed of becoming. The eyes in the portrait shone with inspiration, the lips curved in an enigmatic smile. Raven felt his knees weaken. He fell to the floor, unable to tear his gaze from his creation. His body was exhausted to the limit, but his mind remained clearer than ever. "Is this the end?" he whispered, feeling his heartbeat slow. Suddenly the mirror began to vibrate. Its surface rippled like disturbed water. Theodor raised his head with difficulty and saw his reflection in the mirror come to life. It moved independently, As if having acquired its own will, the reflection Theodor reached out, as if trying to break through the glass. At the same moment, the painted portrait also began to change. The paint seemed to flow. The image on the canvas moved, striving to unite with the reflection in the mirror. Raven watched in horror, unable to move. He felt the last grains of life leaving his body. Suddenly, the mirror cracked. Through the crack poured a bright light, filling the room. Theodor closed his eyes, blinded by its intensity. When he opened them again, he saw that the world around him had changed. He was no longer lying on the floor of his studio. Instead, he stood in a strange, ghostly space, surrounded by countless mirrors. In each of them, he saw reflections, not only of himself, but of all those he had ever painted. Mrs. Gray, Jonathan Foster, dozens of other faces. They were all here, frozen between reality and art, between life and death. And among them was himself, young, full of strength, just as he had depicted himself in the last portrait. Theodor realized he had become part of his own creation. He had created a world where art and reality merged, where souls live forever in reflections and on canvases. "Welcome home, master," a voice sounded, seemingly from everywhere at once. These were the voices of all his portraits, merged into one. Raven looked at his hands. They were once again the hands of a young man. He felt an incredible strength and thirst for creativity within himself. "I'm home," he whispered, and the echo of his voice reflected in the infinity of mirrors. In the real world, in the old mansion on the outskirts of Boston, they found the lifeless body of Theodor Raven. Next to him stood a stunning self-portrait and a cracked mirror in an ebony frame. People said that the face in the portrait seemed alive, that the eyes seemed to follow everyone who dared to look at it. But no one knew the true fate of Theodor Raven. No one suspected that he continues to live and create in the world behind the mirror, in a place where the line between art and reality is forever erased. And they say that sometimes, on particularly dark nights, one can see the portraits in the old mansion come alive, whispering among themselves, and if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of a brush gliding across canvas. It's Theodor Raven, continuing his eternal creativity in the world of reflections.